In early 2012, I was the pastor of my own United Methodist Church near Dover, Delaware. 2 years before that, this congregation had moved from a 130-year-old facility into a new, totally accessible building, a project that was many years and many dollars in the making. Access and inclusion were high on this congregation's list of priorities. Our then new bishop, Peggy Johnson, had led Christ United Methodist Church of the Deaf in Baltimore for 20 years prior to her election as bishop and her assignment to our conference. To help generate interest in deaf ministry in our new building, we invited Bishop Johnson to do a presentation at worship. Several local people who were deaf attended that day to see her preach in American Sign Language. It was into this atmosphere of our church's interest in accessibility in deaf ministry that Logan showed up one Sunday morning. Logan was deaf. I distinctly remember my first encounter with him. He was tall, bearded, and sported a cowboy hat and boots with a western swagger to match. They were from New Mexico. I smiled and I shook hands with him, but after that I realized that I had no place to go, no language to bridge the gap between us, no way of developing a pastoral relationship with him. In that moment, I was embarrassed by my own inadequacies and frankly surprised at my own obliviousness to this world of the deaf that I had never encountered so personally before. And so our education as a church began. Every Sunday, Logan sat in the front pew so he could see. He moved his hands and arms around, speaking in his own language, and his mother, who sat beside him, was signing the service to him. Implied in Logan's very visible presence was that in order to live up to our commitment to be accessible, there were things we, the dominant culture of hearing people, were going to have to sacrifice. It would take money to hire an interpreter, and we had to give up some preconceived notions of what normal in worship looks like. I understand now why it was that although my heart was in the right place that day, the dominant hearing ableist world that I inhabit made me all but useless in this initial encounter with Logan, and later with others, including my future husband, Carl, who, like Logan, was born deaf. Carl was born profoundly deaf in 1956 in Wilmington, Delaware. In this last decade since I met Carl, I've come to understand that being born deaf in that decade, the trajectory of his life was fundamentally locked in by the way the dominant hearing world he lives in viewed him and controlled his access to language and everything that flows from language in life. In getting to know my husband and his world, I've also gradually come to realize that access for and acceptance of a single or even a few people who are deaf in a hearing worship service is only the tip of the iceberg for deaf ministry. Fast forward a decade, and I'm retired now, and this educational video that you're watching is the culmination of my work toward a Doctor of Ministry degree from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you for taking the time and the energy to watch this video and to participate in this research that I'm doing regarding deaf ministry. I don't want anyone to think that I'm putting myself forward as an expert on deaf matters just because I married a deaf man. I am certainly no expert. But I am sort of a bridge person at this point. By virtue of my marriage, I've gained a lot of experience with people who are deaf, and my husband has given me the motivation to learn about his world. But when I started the journey, I was an active pastor just like you. And back then, I was pretty much oblivious to the deaf world. Maybe some of you are equally uninformed on this subject. I remember what it was like to have very little experience with deafness. And what little experience I had was almost exclusively with a particular segment of the deaf and hard of hearing world, those who become deaf later in life. I don't think I ever had even met a person born deaf whose first language was American Sign Language. So I'm speaking to you now, hearing pastor to hearing pastor, because I understand that point of view. We are the norm, hearing pastors serving hearing churches. I hope, having one foot in each world, deaf and hearing, maybe I can be helpful in fostering understanding and education for hearing pastors on this subject. But I have to be careful. Being a part of the dominant hearing culture, there is a danger of expressing my own personal opinions or erroneous ideas or prejudices, rather than the deaf perspective. I'm going to try to avoid this pitfall by sharing video clips of people who are deaf expressing themselves about their own world, and by relying on good, solid, up-to-date research, much of it done by people who are deaf themselves. And finally, I hope to offer some ideas that may be new to most hearing pastors about best pastoral care practices with adults who are deaf, about fresh ways to interpret relevant scripture passages, and most important, best pastoral practices with new hearing parents of a baby who is born deaf. So, here we go. There's an initial fact that we need to address before we go any farther. The fact is that there is a Grand Canyon-sized difference between the experience of people who become deaf later in life and those who are born deaf or who become deaf so early in life that they do not experience spoken language as hearing people do. So let's start with the late deafened people. These are the folk that hearing people know and understand the best. These are often our grandparents who gradually lose their hearing as they age. They've spent much of their lives as hearing and speaking people whose first language is English. Usually they can read and write English fluently, and they can speak fluent English clearly so that other hearing people can easily understand them. Their only problem then is that they need to find ways to support or amplify what hearing they have left. Or they need a way to turn the spoken word of others into the written word. The following video is produced by the Minnesota Department of Human Services, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services Division.
Age-related hearing loss. Hearing loss is one of the most common conditions that comes with aging. Age-related hearing loss affects 1 out of 3 people between the ages of 65 and 74 in the United States. Nearly half of seniors will experience hearing loss by age 75 or older. Age-related hearing loss can be caused by physical changes inside your ears, exposure to noise during your life, side effects of medication, or medical condition. Warning signs. Because age-related hearing loss often occurs gradually, you may not realize you have a hearing loss. Warning signs include asking other people to repeat themselves or to speak more clearly, finding it hard to hear when there is a lot of background noise, finding it hard to hear in situations where it wasn't a problem in the past, needing to turn up the volume on the television or radio, and avoiding, or withdrawing from social situations. In most cases, age-related hearing loss cannot be reversed. Losing your hearing can be a difficult and frustrating life change. The impact of hearing loss is compounded if you are losing your vision. This is referred to as a dual sensory loss or sometimes deafblind. Early intervention. Early intervention is critical. Untreated hearing loss can lead to isolation, depression, and anxiety. Recent studies have linked untreated hearing loss to a greater risk of dementia and increase your risk of falls and other safety concerns. Regular screening with a doctor or hearing professional can help you identify changes in your hearing and make recommendations for assistive technology and communication strategies. You may feel uncomfortable telling people about your hearing loss, but it is important to learn how to ask for help. This is called self-advocacy. Some options to include pen and paper, speech-to-text programs, closed captioning for television programming and DVDs, captioning phones, apps, and cards, or communication access real-time translation. Home modification, smart home technology, and simpler assistive devices can also help you live safely and independently.
I find that when I talk to church members or pastors about deaf ministry, they usually think first about these late deafened members. There's a natural reason for this, of course. First, there are likely to be dozens of those folk in any given church who are either members themselves or relatives of members. So it feels more like an immediate and personal issue to try to reconnect them with their church, and their community, and social experiences. Second, as a hearing person, it's easier to relate to their situation. We as hearing people can imagine how isolated and frustrated we would feel if we lost our means of communicating with our friends and family. Third, in these technological times, it isn't hard to find ways to help these folk. Things like improved sound systems in the church, or translation apps on our phones, captions in movies, printing out documents. Then there are the resources that we can help them find for getting hearing aids or cochlear implants. And we can hook them up with support groups and other helpful organizations. We definitely need to continue to think about these folk and seek out ways to help reintegrate them into our church communities if that's what they need. It's all too easy to neglect their needs. But these are also the people for whom our hearing intuition and instincts work the best. Now we need to make a 180-degree turn and address other experiences of deafness. Those who are born deaf or who are born profoundly hard of hearing. These are also the people who become deaf so early in life that they really don't experience spoken language. And these are also people who lose their hearing at some point and choose to embrace the deaf culture as their own. Hearing people frequently only notice these folk on the periphery of our lives. Maybe there's a group of people who are deaf at a table in a restaurant signing with each other. Surrounding hearing people might be fascinated watching them, for instance. Carl and I experience this frequently. But hearing people often feel shy about trying to interact with them. Frequently, the first reaction of hearing people to early deafened people using sign language is to avoid them. out of concern that an encounter might be awkward. I'm a little embarrassed to share this, but maybe it'll help you if you're feeling this way. Twice, I turned down invitations to lunch from my future husband just because I couldn't imagine how we would get through an entire lunch without a mutual language between us. The third time was the charm. I took the leap and accepted his invitation, which he had jotted on a scrap of paper. So ultimately, it was Carl's charm and skill in dealing with the language barrier between us that bridged the gap. And all I had to do was follow his lead. And the rest is history. The one thing connected to early deaf people that most hearing people have encountered at some point is American Sign Language interpreters. Maybe we've seen them on TV, where there's a news conference, or maybe we've attended a concert or a lecture or something where there happened to be one. Young people, growing up, may have had a deaf child mainstreamed into their school environment, where that child may have had an interpreter with them during classes. The following video is a TED Talk out of Bend, Oregon. Hearing interpreters, Andrew Tolman and Lauren Tolo, give us a little introduction to their jobs and best practices with ASL interpreters.
So imagine you're getting all settled into your seat, nice and cozy. Maybe you're at the theater, maybe you're at the book tour of your favorite author.
Or maybe a TED Talk.
When you're getting settled in, you notice there's a sign language interpreter at the front. How many of you saw that and thought, this is going to be really cool? Sign language is so beautiful, and got a little more cozy, right? Sign language, yes, for sign language. Sign language is beautiful, let me tell you. And the interpreting process is absolutely cool. But interpreters are not performers. Interpreters are an important part of accessibility and inclusion. And think about the deaf people that are there. They're the ones that requested the accommodation, but they rarely get the same attention in those kinds of spaces. Being an interpreter is not glamorous. It's actually very, very, very hard work. And just as much as it is our job to provide our skills to the deaf community, it is equally, if not more important, for us to work alongside hearing people like yourselves who do not know American Sign Language and often need crucial information from deaf or hard of hearing people. A doctor needs to know exactly what's wrong with their patient. A teacher needs to know that their student comprehends all lectures and homework. An interpreter in those situations is given a lot of trust to facilitate all of those dynamics effectively.
According to the 2011 American Community Survey, roughly 11 million individuals consider themselves deaf or have serious difficulty hearing. Many of these people identify culturally as deaf with a capital D, not hearing impaired. Deaf people as a cultural identity are richly diverse, and today they are making strides in every field, developing new medical advances and inventing new technologies. They are lawyers and CEOs and political candidates, and they are revolutionizing the idea of universal access. There are many situations in which you may all have never thought about life from a perspective other than hearing. But I want you to take a moment and think back to your favorite class in elementary school. Or think back to your first job interview. Maybe a time you were scared to receive some news. Or maybe your first court appearance for a speeding ticket. The birth of your child. Or a funeral. Interpreters are often a rotating cast of strangers in these and so many other moments of deaf people's lives. Andrew and I have been those strangers in the room and those extra bodies and on the video screen. We are privy to stories that are not our own and experience moments in people's lives that we would never otherwise have knowledge of. Professional interpreters are called to work for respect for consumers and coworkers, while also prioritizing confidentiality and privacy. Those stories, good and bad, belong to the deaf community and are not for interpreters to tell.
Let's go back now to specifically church life. The Americans with Disabilities Act, signed into existence by President George H.W. Bush on July 26, 1990, has dramatically improved the lives of many disabled people. This act requires sign language for people who are deaf in most public or government settings, such as doctors' offices, legal situations, and so forth. But I was hurt to come to understand that churches are excluded from this legal requirement. Still, occasionally, churches respond to their hearts, consciences, or necessities and provide interpreters, as we did at Wyoming for Logan. And eventually, providing an interpreter every week drew in several other deaf individuals who use sign language. One problem, though, is that just having an interpreter in a fundamentally hearing worship experience does not mean that early deafened people will come to hearing-centered churches, or if they do come, that there will be many of them, or that their experience will be positive. There's so much more to being involved in a faith community than just worship. There are all the informal activities, starting with that friendly chatter that goes on and catching up with each other before and after services. Full participation in the church experience extends through Bible studies, administrative meetings, covered dishes, children's programs, and so forth. How can a deaf person who uses ASL feel included and involved in all these varied activities and experiences of churches if no one there knows how to speak their language? There's one giant flashing red problem in all of these settings, and that's communication. We speak different languages. Sometimes the person who is deaf has learned how to bridge that gap. Maybe they hear enough using technology and have learned how to navigate the hearing world somehow. But sometimes it's just too challenging for everyone. It can be tiring, struggling to convey simple messages back and forth. Sometimes everyone just gives up. Another problem is that typical hearing church services are very auditory in nature. Think for a minute about all the long, repetitive, wordy prayers and liturgies, or hymns using ancient language, or repetitive phrases difficult to interpret, or organ music with no words, no video, no pictures, which can be totally dead time for a person who is deaf. Then there are those behind-the-scenes discussions surrounding providing an interpreter. Even if a pastor gets to the place of entertaining that idea with an appropriate administrative group in the church, their first knee-jerk argument is almost always, why do we need an interpreter? We don't have any people who are deaf in our church. The answer, of course, is, well, maybe we don't have any people who are deaf because we don't provide an interpreter. But this seems to be a steep learning curve for hearing congregations and sometimes for pastors too. And why is that? Well, in one word, cost. The next issue for churches when considering interpreters. Interpreters are expensive. They deserve every penny, but it's just a fact. It costs a lot to provide an interpreter for a church. And at least where we're serving here on the Eastern Shore of Delaware and Maryland, there aren't many interpreters willing to work on Sunday mornings with all the preparation involved and possibly doing it for a reduced rate because it's a nonprofit. It's a rare professional interpreter willing to do this every Sunday. Right about now, I feel like Debbie Downer. Wah, wah. I don't mean that deaf ministry is impossible, but it's best for hearing pastors to understand up front the challenges that they're facing before trying. It saves time and effort in the long run. It sure seems like the communication gap between those who use ASL and the hearing world who don't presents some overwhelming barriers. How on earth did we get to this point? The educational video that you're watching right now will attempt to explain how we got here, and I hope it will give the participants in this project a way to think about deaf ministry that is more realistic, informed, and effective. The first step is for hearing people in churches to take several steps backwards and stop trying to jump ahead and do things that seem to us like the right thing for them. Instead, we just need to open our hearts and minds and get to know more about the deaf world.